Peace, peace, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Truth, Trust, and Trajectory with your girl, Shakim B. And if you guys are finding this video, welcome back. This is episode 1 of my trauma mini series. So I'm glad you guys are here today. We're going to be talking about something that affects so many of us, whether we realize it or not, and that is trauma. Now, I know the word trauma can feel heavy. It might not even make you think, well, I haven't been through anything that bad. But here's the thing. Trauma isn't just about the big dramatic events we see in movies. It's about how our brains and bodies respond to the experiences that we feel and that trigger us to feel overwhelmed or scared or things that are out of our control. And here's why this matters. Trauma does not just live in the past. It shapes how we think, how we feel, and how we show up in the world, sometimes in ways we don't even realize. So, in this episode, we're going to break it all down. We're going to be talking about what trauma really is and how it might be affecting you, and why understanding is the first step towards healing. So, before we get into it, if this topic resonates with you guys, if you've ever felt like something from your past is still weighing you down, please do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. This is the first episode in a series, and I don't want you guys to miss what's coming next. And keep watching. All right, guys, welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Today, I want to start with the basics. What is trauma? So, trauma is an experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. It is something that leaves you feeling helpless, unsafe, or powerless. And here's the thing, it's not just about the event itself, it's about how your brain and your body respond to that event. For example, let's say you were in a car accident. The accident itself might only last a few seconds, but the way your brain and your body process that experience can last for years. You might feel anxious every time you get into a car, or you might freeze up when you hear a loud noise. That's trauma at work. Because trauma isn't just about a single event like a car accident or a natural disaster. It can also come from repeated experiences like growing up in a home where you felt constantly criticized or being in a relationship where you were made to feel small. The key thing is to understand this. Trauma isn't about how bad the event was, it's about how it affected you. And that's why two people can go through the same experience and walk away completely different with a different perspective and a different response. So now I want to ask you guys at home, have you had any experiences that you've had in life that felt or you perceived as not being traumatic? How have they sculpted the way that you perceive life? How do they show up in your everyday life? Now that we've talked about what trauma is, let's talk about the different types of trauma because not all trauma looks the same. So, the first one I want to talk about is acute trauma. This is trauma that comes from one single event, like an accident, a natural disaster, or a violent attack. It's usually tied to a specific moment in time. And for me, one thing that I noticed is I still have an acute trauma response to tied around safety. I did talk about this on one of my previous episodes where I had an attack on my life. And while this happened some time ago, when I go to bed, I still bolt myself into my room because there is a level of safety that was compromised during that time that now feels very it still feels new even though it's not, even though I know that the threat is not still there. um it just makes me feel more secure to make sure I bolt my door. The next one I want to talk about is chronic trauma. So, this is the type of trauma that happens repeatedly over time. So, that could look like ongoing abuse, bullying, or living in a highly stressful environment. So, with chronic trauma, there are many different types of chronic trauma. This could stem from childhood abuse or neglect. It can also stem from domestic violence, repeated exposure to violence, or emotional abuse within a family or a relationship. It can also show up as a byproduct of community violence or war zones. So you see this a lot with military personnel or wartime veterans. Chronic trauma can also show up in discrimination and oppression. So with people that experience like racism, sexism, homophobia, or other forms of systematic oppression can accumulate as a form of trauma over time. And then also living with a chronic illness or disability. So that looks like constant medical challenges, whether they're physical or mental, they can create a state of prolonged stress and trauma. And then the effects of chronic trauma on mental health. So, a lot of people that suffer from chronic trauma end up getting what's called a PTSD, which is post traumatic stress disorder. It can include like flashbacks or being hyper vigilant and even disassociation. And then even going further into depth with this, some of the things that start to show up is like cognitive difficulties. So this could look like someone having a hard time solving problems or having memory issues or even having concentration, short attention span, or being able to make decisions. And then to take it a step further, you can also see like chronic trauma could lead to like somatic symptoms. So, what this looks like is when it starts to manifest into the body. So, this shows up as chronic pain, digestive issues, headaches, and autoimmune conditions. And then we have a complex trauma, which comes from a multiple layered experience, like growing up in a dysfunctional family or being in a long term abusive relationship. And then lastly, it's developmental trauma. So this happens during childhood when your brain and body are still developing. It can come from things like neglect, emotional abuse, or growing up in an unstable environment. And then there's something called secondary trauma, which happens when you are exposed to someone else's trauma. Like if you're a caregiver, a first responder, or even a close friend or family member of someone who's been through something traumatic. The reason it's important to understand these different types of trauma is because they can show up in different ways. For example, someone with acute trauma might have flashbacks or nightmares about specific events, while someone with complex trauma might struggle with trust or self esteem in a more general way. So, I want to ask you guys at home, have you witnessed anyone that has any of these levels of trauma? Do you yourself suffer from any level of trauma that I have discussed or mentioned? And if so, what does that look like? How does it show up in your life? Okay, so now I want to talk about how trauma actually affects you. The answer is different for everyone, but there are some common ways that it might show up. The first way is emotionally. So you might see or feel anxious, depressed, or numb. You might have mood swings or feel like you're constantly on edge. Physically, it can show up in your body as chronic pain, fatigue, or even digestive issues. It can also affect your sleep. Maybe you're having trouble falling asleep, or you wake up in the middle of the night feeling panicked. Behaviorally, you might see yourself avoiding certain places, people, or situations because they remind you of the trauma. Or maybe you might engage in behaviors that help you cope in the moment, like overworking, overeating, or using substances, but they don't actually help you heal. And relationally, trauma can affect how you connect with others. Maybe you struggle to trust people, or you find yourself in relationships that feel familiar but unhealthy. The thing to remember is these responses are not your fault. They're your brain and body's way of trying to protect you. But the good news is, once you understand how trauma is affecting you, then you can start taking steps towards healing. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, wow, this sounds like me, I want you to know something. You're not alone. And more importantly, you're not broken. Trauma is a normal response to abnormal experiences. The first step towards healing is understanding. And now that you know what trauma is, the different types, and how it might be affecting you, you're already on your way. In the next episode, we're going to be diving deep into the science of trauma and how your body and brain respond. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you guys subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if you're looking for more resources to support your healing journey, please head over to my website, truthtrustandtrajectory.com. You guys are going to find some tools, guides, and even more in depth content to help you take the next step. Until then, make sure you've remembered this: healing is possible, it is not always easy, and it is not always linear. but it's possible. And you don't have to do it alone. Let me know in the comments which one thing you're taking away from today's episode. Until next time, I will see you guys later. Okay, bye.